Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Council's Report to Mission. And this is our second one this year, about 6 months after our last one in January of 2021, or 2022, I should say. So thank you very much for joining us on one of our few warm summer nights. If you're not catching us live and you've been smart and you spent some of your time out in the backyard and you're getting us on record, thank you as well for watching. For those of you who are online, we're going to spend a few minutes on some update and then later on have an opportunity to answer your questions. But you don't need to wait to put your questions in. You can start typing them into the comments right now. I'm joined by Taryn Hubbard, our Manager of Communications, and she will happily pass along the questions to me when we get to that portion of things later on. Let's start, as we like to traditionally do here, with a land acknowledgement and recognize that Mission is situated on the unceded, ancestral, and shared territory of the Stolo people. The city of Mission specifically is located on the Lekamel, Samath, Kwantlen, Skalitz, Mathwe, and Katzie traditional territories. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous reconciliation as one of our priority areas later on. You'll notice I do not have a perfect opera voice tonight. It's allergy season for me, as I'm sure it is for many of you, but we will soldier through and do our best, so hopefully you can understand me, but please forgive me as I sip on some tea and some water to get through the evening. So after I finish introducing our report this evening, we're going to give you a bit of an update on the city's progress and some of our key initiatives, and that's going to take about a third of our time, hopefully a little less, and then we'll answer your questions. So we're going to go till about 8 o'clock tonight in total. You can also get a hard copy of what we're talking about tonight, at least the update portion, and you can either download it on mission.ca or on the very Facebook page that you're on right now. It was posted earlier. Or you can stop by at the library or City Hall or Welton Common and get a copy of this. It's just one example of some of the work we're trying to do to improve our communication with the community, both in terms of hearing from you as well as sharing with you what's going on in the community. Tonight, my update will not be exhaustive, although we're going to cover a lot of territory. We are going to leave some things that you may want to ask about, but we're going to cover progress in some of the more key areas aligned with council priorities. And so we're going to talk about the areas of community, environment, livability in a broad way, people, and reconciliation. So let's start with community. Oh, it sounds like we got a bit of feedback there. Everything good? Okay, great. So let's start off by talking about community. I think it's really been an important conversational topic, not just in Mission, but in BC and Canada, to think about affordable housing. Before I was elected, the council had already undertaken to do a housing needs assessment, and I was in the community and had an opportunity to be a small part of that, and I know it well and understood exactly when I came aboard the last year and a half ago how important it was for councils already, the work they were already doing on affordable housing to continue moving forward. So it was a great reward to myself and council that we were able to approve the affordable housing strategy earlier this year. That strategy includes 50 different recommendations or actions. They're not recommendations, they're actions. And 13 of them in particular were treated as high priorities. And we're already acting on many of those. For example, we're working with Mission Community Services and Sarah for Women to identify housing sites for youth in the case of MCSS, and women and families in transition with Sarah for Women. We are also working on the hiring right now, as we speak, of our social housing coordinator. This person's job will be to help us finish our policy development so that we will be able to work with developers in a very agile way when they come in the door and understand what we expect from them in terms of building affordable housing. And they will actually help to navigate people after we've got some housing stock more in the supply to the housing that we have. And the good news is we already have actually been able to bring some housing online. In fact, one of the most touching moments for myself and many of the members of council happened about 3 weeks ago, where we got to go and open up the last 12 homes in the Habitat for Humanity complex. We really want to thank all of council, but particularly Councillor Hamilton, who first came to council with this invitation to work with Habitat for Humanity. And council at that time sold land at a discounted rate to Habitat for Humanity on the Cedar Connector, and then worked with Habitat in a variety of ways to reduce costs and impact. And councillors even went out there with hammers and started actually helping to build the project. And so we were able to be there on a very rainy day a few weeks ago as we welcomed the last 12 families and took them into their homes for the first time. And I can tell you it was genuinely a very touching moment. Some of these people had fled countries that were going through civil war or extraordinary poverty. And not only were they living in the first actual suitable housing you might imagine for a family in their lives, but they had also contributed dozens or hundreds of hours themselves to not-for-profits, and in particular to Habitat for Humanity. So here were these people who were living through poverty who were actually giving back, and it was a really lovely reward for them, and also very clear to me that we were welcoming people to our community who were very interested in being community members and contributing to the community. So that was one example. We continue to work with Mission Community Services and BC Housing in forwarding the project on Heard Street. We got caught up in a bit of a bureaucratic situation where the typical environmental review that's done by the ministry was then audited just as a random act by a body that does this for a select number of applications. They just randomly draw them. And unfortunately, that slowed the process down even further. My understanding is that the audit and the environmental review are done, and we're going through the planning process in terms of getting that housing built. But we've said two things to BC Housing and to the ministry. We've really written to them and said, please expedite so that we're building this housing sooner, not leaving people out in the wilderness and in the wet as the seasons get cold again. And second, we want to work with BC Housing right now to identify other suitable housing sites in Mission before without waiting an extended period of time. And I'll talk a little bit more about housing later on, but those are a few examples of some of the housing things we've done. We also have really tried, as I mentioned earlier, to improve the amount of input we're getting from community members in our ongoing developments, whether it's strategic planning or whether it's development planning or neighborhood planning. We have leaned into an idea that if we engage the community early on, the product will be far better, and the amount of stress and conflict that happens during planning processes will be reduced. And that's absolutely been what we're experiencing right now. So I want to give a nod to Marilyn Davidson, who's one of our neighbors, who suggested to us that we start using a vehicle that she had been familiar with called Community Conversations. And so we did that. We did one in arts and culture, which was the specific one that she suggested. We've done one on North Mission, and we have a second one on North Mission coming up this very Wednesday evening. We've done one on our downtown, and we've used a similar type of format for our Builder Forum, which I'll speak about later on, and a homelessness forum. And what's interesting about this community conversation model that we've adopted and modified to fit our own needs is that each of the members of council has been trained to be a facilitator. So rather than going there and telling people things or simply getting into a town hall format where you have to stand at a microphone, you're having these meaningful conversations with councillors, cycling around the room and giving your input. And these pieces of input are already playing a role in things like budget decisions, the way we vote on specific applications, and the policy directions we're going to be going in the next year or so. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So those community conversations have been a very powerful tool and something I think we'll be doing more of. We also borrowed an idea from the Squamish Council. I think it was Squamish, Taryn, is that correct? Where they were doing council coffees, and this was another one that came our way. And so this has been a great tool as well. Once a month, councillors have been going out in groups of 3 to local coffee shops and sitting down with residents and talking about issues as simple as how is their garbage pickup going in their neighborhood, or how's traffic, what's going on with the bears in their neighborhood. And this has been a really good way for people to come and speak on a person-to-person level with a councillor. It takes out some of the intimidation factor, and for us on council, it's fantastic because we're getting real feedback from people, and that can be difficult sometimes to receive. We still will be using surveys and so forth, and we'll talk about those more later on, but there's something to be said for that human touch. And this is as well an example of the type of dialogue creation we're trying to create as much as possible, and I'm sure there'll be more of those as we continue on. And we did, as I mentioned, have our first Builders Forum. So as you probably have heard, this has been a big issue, not only in Mission, but across the Fraser Valley. People have been finding it extraordinarily difficult to get through the planning and building permitting processes. And of course, it's expensive to wait as well because you have loan costs, carrying costs as you're waiting for your permit to come in, and those costs keep piling up while you're waiting. So we wanted to sit down with builders for 2 reasons. First, we wanted to tell them what we were doing and make it clear to folks that we were taking their concerns seriously and tell them about the investments we've been making in those departments. For example, we've hired 5 new staff in that building department, and we funded them from the builder department revenue themselves instead of from tax revenue. We've invested in new software, 2 different kinds of software, the Microsoft 365 suite that many of you use at home, as well as an enterprise software program that's still coming online. We've done a process review and wanted people to understand that so that we'd simplify the process. But we also wanted to learn from builders, so we had Canadian Home Builders Fraser Valley there to tell us some of the practices they've experienced in other communities in the Fraser Valley. And we had individual builders. Some were small, some were larger, and some were in between, telling us what's working. And something magical happened at that evening, and that is that experienced builders started to share tips with less experienced builders. The feedback we received at the end of the evening was that people had found it a very productive evening. The Canadian Home Builders Association said it was the best forum of that type that they'd been to, and people encouraged us to do more of them. Our staff were exceptional that night. They aren't public speakers as a matter of course, but they all came to the microphone over the course of the evening's program and gave people tips based on what their job description includes on how they could expedite applications. And one of the things that people came away understanding, and I could hear people saying it, experienced developers saying it to less experienced developers, were things like invest in good engineers and architects and good builders and good professional scientists, and follow the policies of the city carefully instead of trying to get a city councilor or the mayor to go and find out what's going on with your application. Actually work with our staff and have your people working through the process. And in the last few months, we've started to make some headway. Smaller applications, the amount of wait time, things like renovations to a home, have just decreased to about 2 weeks. And our larger applications have gone from about 9 months now down to getting about closer to 7 months, and we still have some progress to be made there, significant progress to be made there. And to be completely honest with people, the next thing will be for us to do that on the planning application side. We know that planning applications in stream are extraordinary. The number of housing units coming to our community is really an amazing number. And more are being planned as we speak. And more importantly, employment lands are also in the pipeline. Jobs through commercial, institutional, and industrial lands are also coming through our departments, and we want to expedite those, but it's difficult to do. So the Builder Forum was both educational for us and for the community. We also were able to onboard permanently our emergency program manager, Monique Weir. She's fantastic. She was working with us on a part-time basis, but as we all saw last year, the risk of wildfires, heat domes, and atmospheric rivers are probably going to be with us for some time, not just the sort of the standard major fires, which are themselves quite important. And so she's been doing things like presenting documents like this for us, coming and working with community groups to have community resilience. So local programs, for example, if you live in Steelhead, she's been working with Steelhead around things like generators and meeting places and radios to help people up in those communities if they're ever in a catastrophe, to be well positioned until larger supplies of help can come. So we're excited by her work, and we'll talk about one of the things that she's been doing in just a moment. Let's move on to environment. I would say that first, there's a lot of work still to come in environment, and it's not on the slide, but I think one of the most exciting things is that actually on July 18th agenda, I expect that Council will have the opportunity to approve our environmental charter. The first time, I think it's since 2008, that an environmental charter has been revised here. We did our very first one in 2008, and it hasn't been revised since then. So we really didn't have a robust opportunity to include things like climate change thinking and active transportation into that plan. So that plan will be coming before us, as will a replacement for our very ineffective tree cutting bylaw. The tree cutting bylaw has been a miserable failure, only applies to a small amount of part of the town, and has really proven to be all but unenforceable. So instead, we've realized there's a much bigger issue in the areas of land clearing, where people are going in and they're doing wholesale clearing parcels of property. And not only is that destroying potentially habitat and vegetation, but it's also leading to things like streams being redirected onto other people's property, siltation of streams and the loss of habitat, and mudslides. So we really want to make sure that we have a policy in place that protects neighbors, wildlife, and environment from people who would come in and sort of unethically clear a property and then come to the community and ask us to rezone it or to subdivide it. Let's talk about some of the things that are on the slide. Let me take a sip of tea here first. So the first is the 7th Avenue Greenway. We heard lots from people on this one. Concerns about parking were one of the issues, and some people just simply don't believe that it's something that's going to be popular or useful. But it's an interesting thing when you live in elected life. You'll hear from people who are absolutely against something in one call or one email, and the next call or email, you get somebody who is absolutely considers this to be their biggest priority. And I'm going to tell you, plain and simple, that on this one, I don't think that there's a clear majority of one side of people versus the other. But I will say I think a couple of things have been swaying. And the first one that's been very swaying is that when we talk to the people who would use the Greenway, they're a compelling group of people to listen to. They're people, for example, who are seniors who want to be able to use their scooters, or people who are low income who want to be able to use an e-bike, or a youth who wants to be able to use their bicycle, or a parent who wants to be able to walk their child in a stroller. And so we recognize the terrain restraints and also the climate restraints in our community, the fact that it can get cold here. But what we think we've arrived at is a plan that will allow us to start this in a phased way. So the first phase will be getting built beginning this summer as we start on the eastern portion from Grand Street down 7th all the way to Stave Lake Street, and then people will be able to connect on the remainder of 7th right into Heritage Park. And the good news is that's not going to really impact any commercial parking at all. And in fact, the small mall, which is at the north end of Welton and James, most people don't realize this, but it's actually owned by the city. They'll actually get an improved parking lot and a pathway that goes around the parking lot so that people don't have to walk in front of cars anymore the way that they currently do. So it's actually going to improve parking. And the great news is that we've been funded by UBCM with a grant for this. I'm sorry, by the federal government for this. And we've actually got an application we're hoping will come in for a second grant. And we believe we'll actually be able to pay for the vast majority of this project through federal grant monies. I'm also really excited by another project that's probably not been as much talked about as much as it should, and a really big coup for a grant. So this is one of those win-win situations that council gets to sort of be a part of, and they happen rarely, but when they happen, they're kind of magic. And that's the fact that all of that stinky gas that you can smell on a hot day like today at the James wastewater treatment plant is not only stinky, but it's also really bad for the environment. It's about 20 times more impactful on our climate footprint than CO2 is. Methane gas is that much more likely to cause the greenhouse effect. But the good news is that it's also a ready source of renewable energy. And so because of a $4.7 million grant, we're able to build a biogas catchment facility there and use the gas that comes off of that facility to actually power that facility and potentially to sell off excess gas or excess electricity to others in the area. So it's a win-win. It won't smell as bad, it won't be as bad for the environment, and it will be a source of savings when it comes to fueling the plant itself. Another exciting one, and another one that hasn't had a lot of press, is that we have been reached out to by UBC to enter into an agreement to utilize our municipal forest as a place for climate research. And we've undertaken that, and I've sat down with the students that are doing that and actually had some really exciting interview processes right off the bat. And as part of that interview, I came to realize something, and that is that we think of our municipal forest for all of its benefits over its history. First, of course, it was a source of jobs and revenue for the city for many years, but it's also been more recently a source of pride for us as a recreational place and as an environmental reserve. But it's also played two other roles in recent times. One, it's been the site of some really exciting reconciliation opportunities, including two woodlots, one with Catesy and one with Kwantlen, and we'll talk about an interesting partnership that we did with Kwantlen, Lacamel, and Matsqui here shortly that's taking part in that forest. But the final one, and the one that is kind of completely been forgotten, is the use of our forest as a place to better understand and to better prepare for climate change. I sleep less well in the summer than most people because when I hear sirens go by, I worry about our forest. I worry about wildfire. And when this opportunity to research how climate change is affecting our forest and for us to use that research to actually be more prepared and to actually help educate others came our way, it was just a simple win-win. So that was an exciting one, and stay tuned for more as that research is undergoing. I mentioned earlier that Monique had been preparing materials, and one of the things that she's been doing is helping us to prepare for that risk of wildfire by holding Fire Smart forums with the help of Taryn Hubbard, and they have been holding these forums. They had some in the spring, and help people to understand how to harden their homes, reduce the risk of fire going from a tree into their yard or their home, and to clear away brush that might have otherwise been sources of fuel. And that fuel was then chipped and taken to our compost facility. So again, it was a win-win all around. I'll be talking about our environmental charter more in a few moments as well, but I've already spoken about it here, and I think that's really one of the key ones. Livability. We are in the process, just today, in fact, Council had an entire afternoon meeting dedicated to the subject of updating our developer contributions. Now, I want to be really clear as I say this, because I'm going to talk about some numbers that might be a bit surprising to people. These are numbers that we will be asking developers to pay to help pay for the growth that is a result of new residential development in our community in particular. Our last development cost charge review was in about 2018. I have to go back and look at my notes from today. And in the amount of time since that last development cost charge review, the cost of development, the infrastructure that we would pay for, things like roads, sewers, storm drainage, and water and parkland have gone up so much that we will likely need to increase our developer contributions by a factor of 3 times or more. That's how quickly we become outstripped if we don't constantly review those. And so we looked at other competitor communities and realized we are charging far less, and as a result getting further behind, and it's important that new development pays for itself. Similarly, there's something called community amenity contributions, and even more shockingly, these had not been updated since 2011. And to give you an idea of how long ago that was, I was on council in 2011, and I was young then, and so that gives you all you need to know. So those contributions are at about $2,800 per home, and they're likely again going to need to multiply by a factor of about 3. And these pay for things like the playgrounds and the libraries and the recreational facilities and the fire halls and all of the things that people expect to have in a community when they move into the community. So by having these revisions to developer contributions, we make sure that you, the taxpayer, aren't being unfairly burdened as we accommodate new growth. Another thing that you've seen around town, and this hasn't necessarily been done in the last 6 months, but it's an opportune time for us to talk about this because people are out walking and enjoying our neighborhoods, are the numerous sidewalk and crosswalk improvements that have been around our community. And I think we've got 7, as you can see in the graphic here, like this. And some of them actually have speed reader devices as well, but most of them have this overhead signage, they're properly lit, and they have a pedestrian actuation. They not only are safer, but one of the things I've heard from members of the community is they've really improved the sidewalk improvements that go along with them and the signage, the looks of our neighborhoods, and have modernized our neighborhoods. And council has really heard this and really wants to make sure that we have a routine program of adding more of these and building out sidewalks in neighborhoods that have gone without them for too long over time, so that our streets are better for people who want to be out there walking along the way. And a variety of other similar improvements. For example, 14th Avenue is not only going to have improved sidewalks, but as our city team is putting the new water and sewer lines underneath that road, just routine replacement of those water and sewer lines, they're also going to replace the walking areas with a multi-use path, something wide enough that people will be able to, again, use a stroller or ride a bike in that area and really see an improved streetscape as well. The third one I want to talk about is one that you probably saw going on over the winter. After about 4.5 years of much haggling and wrangling, we were able to work through all of the processes with all the different stakeholders, the statutory right-of-way, the DFO approvals, the grant funding, the borrowing, and the logistics of having the river water dredged or the river sand dredged onto the banks and bringing in the personnel and actually literally having to innovate a way of drawing the sewer force main across the river from the south to the north. But thankfully that project is complete and was successful and is online as of April of this year. And even better news, the old sewage line has, it didn't fail. We didn't get a tragedy, a sewage spillage. And instead, that line may actually be, we're going to inspect it and hopefully be able to bring it up to standards so that as we have future growth, or if we ever have a problem with our new line, we'll have redundancy there and space for growth. And a lot of the last 4 years have been spent on really the strategies and the way that we plan our communities. And so I want to speak a little bit before I go off this slide about some master planning. So it's not terribly exciting to most people in the community to think about roads and transportation, and it's even less exciting to think about sewer and water lines. But if we don't plan for those things in a master planning way every 5 years or so, we get the costs of things get out of control, and we lose, I'll call it currency, on what the state of our infrastructure is. So Mission's undertaken what we call an asset management strategy, and we've completed master planning for our utilities, the underground stuff, the sewer, the water, and the drainage, as well as our transportation system, so our roads and our transit network and so forth. And so we've correctly and accurately costed those things. That allows us to tell us how much we need to be saving, how much we need to be asking developers to put into the kitty, and we've got those plans looking 25 and 27 years ahead. We also recently adopted the change to the official community plan, or for the central neighborhood plan. Now, I mentioned this the night it was passed. It's been a rather remarkable journey to think about this portion of Silverdale. This idea of planning Silverdale for future growth was started literally the year I was born, 56 years ago, and it has truly been historic. Years ago, the city began compiling all of the written documents associated with it, and they would literally fill a room. At the public hearing that happened in 2008, we literally had to interrupt the public hearing to have an election. It became the longest public hearing in Canadian history. So It was an absolutely incredible thing to see that this new plan was approved with a 15-minute public hearing a few weeks ago. Now, that might sound like we were being cavalier, but that's not the point at all. In fact, what that 15-minute public hearing reflected back to us was that an exhaustive amount of work had gone into the constructing of the plan along the way. Instead of the plan being created by scientists and professionals and developers and brought before the city for citizens to say yes or no to, instead citizens had a meaningful way to have input into the plan at multiple points along the way, specific to their own property, their own neighborhoods. The plan was also different in the sense that it was grounded in newer thinking. In 2008 and 2011, in that era, the plan was talked about with one concern coming up more commonly than any other: urban sprawl. And that word just simply wasn't a part of the conversation we've had with people around the central neighborhood plan. Why? More than 43% of the land will be preserved as green space, including the Manzer urban forest. And we ground truthed everything there against the financial realities and the environmental realities. And so we used a denser approach where compact development is situated in areas that are well suited to it, and wildlife corridors, protected natural assets, salmon habitat, and areas that will feed existing wells were all preserved. That's pretty good news for a guy like me who lives beside a stream there and who lives on a well. And the other thing that was considered was how it will look from people as they are driving into the area, whether it's the Mission Bridge or the Silvermere Causeway, and being able to see that the hillside that defines Southwest Mission or Silverdale will still look much the way it does. So we have a nodal or neighborhood plan approach where people will live close to each other. They will have neighborhood centers where they can work, where they can gather, where they can rub shoulders and maintain the community feel. I think all of that exciting stuff came out of people being willing to work together and to listen to one another. And not only did that plan itself represent excellence in planning, but it has changed the way that we will plan in this community. And since that plan began to catch momentum, we've adopted something here at a council level we call the neighborhood approach, so that we are asking developers of just about anything other than a very small subdivision to engage in the same type of dialogue with community members before they come to a public hearing, to get input before they present the city with their final designs, so that they're hearing people's concerns, answering questions, and building them into the way they're designing things. Similarly, with our waterfront revitalization master plan, roughly 40 years have passed since any really robust industrial or economic activity has happened down there, and it is literally a bit of a ruins in some places. On the east side of the CP rail bridge, more than 88 properties are waiting to be assembled. There's only a few on the west side, and those will likely be the ones that develop first. Excitingly, out of that 300 acres, the vast majority of that property is going to be employment lands. The vast majority of those employment lands will be industrial. Some of them will be institutional, and some will be commercial and mixed use. Some folks have asked about the residential portion. There'll be a very small amount of residential, and it'll be the last lands to develop most likely. There'll be more on the eastern precinct, over towards where the mills currently are, just west of the Clark Mill, over in that area. So why? Well, the answer is the cost of assembling land and the fact that the racetrack and industrial uses are going to have a spot over on the western shores. So noise and disruption should be over there, and people who want to live in a riverfront neighborhood will be over on the eastern side. In order to make the assembly of lands and the reclamation of those lands worthwhile, we will have some residential development there, that it'll be mixed use. There'll be opportunities for people to work in things like educational institutions, professional offices, and in entertainment-based facilities as well. So it's a very exciting plan, and once again, one that included an incredible amount of community input. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we spoke that evening of the public hearing, the number of people who were interacting, and considering especially that we were in COVID time, the number of people who tuned in on Facebook or on our surveys and so forth, or in our Zoom events, was rather remarkable. We also had incredible engagement with First Nations who've demonstrated a real interest in investing in the area as well. And I mentioned already our environmental charter, which is another example of a master planning approach. And I should also quickly mention Stave Heights, the development just over here on the east side of Stave Lake Street. And it's going to be a bit of a showcase for compact development. It's going to preserve our Dermobes Creek and create a corridor for paths for cycling and hiking all the way from the area of Parr Avenue all the way down to the river. You'll be able to go for a walk or a hike or a bike ride from a park that has a view out over the Fraser all the way down to the shores of the Fraser by taking this pathway. Your kids will be able to walk out on a safer Stave Lake Street than they were currently able to do, because the road will be widened and have a multi-use path along the sides of it, and they'll be able to actually go down and enjoy more amenities down at the corner of Prentice, 11th, and Stave Lake Street. People. It's all about people, and we were really thrilled to see that as COVID started to allow us to be together, people enthusiastically started coming out more to events. We didn't have as much time to plan things as we like to sometimes, but we were able to put together Canada Day with the help, particularly of Lacamo and Matsqui First Nations, in a way that really respected the work that remains to be done in that park around archaeological analysis and ground penetrating radar, and that was very inclusive. And what was a really exciting thing that happened that same day was that the Vipor group put together a youth-oriented powwow. Quite coincidentally, it wasn't something that we at the city did, on the Pequelish or former St. Mary's lands just across the footbridge that very same day. And so you could go to Canada Day and you could walk across the bridge to the powwow that same day. And it just shows the spirit of reconciliation that we heard that day and the opportunities that are arising out of it. Similarly, Mission had an opportunity to help the Pride Society, or actually the Fraser Valley Youth Society, who organizes the Pride Festival, as their usual location over in Abbotsford fell apart. And they're celebrating their 10th anniversary, and they came to us and asked us if they could utilize Fraser River Heritage Park. And our Parks and Rec staff were really quick to respond and able to accommodate. So we're able to say, welcome to Pride Week. This is Pride Week, and you can join us at the 10th anniversary of the Pride Festival this Saturday if you want to on the Fraser River Heritage Park grounds. We're going to have a full day of events, including a beverage garden, and you can participate in the walk with us. And we would love to have Fraser Valley Pride come back to us every year. Work that's going on right now that's really important for us is we're working on our community wellness strategy. I said to council when I first came on board that I felt that the strategic plan was excellent and very, very bold, but there was one area we'd kind of overlooked, and it's one we've heard from you about as well, and that is thinking about the wellness of people as our community grows, particularly when it comes to things like education, social services, and healthcare. And so council accepted that feedback and last year began the process of funding a community wellness strategy. That is underway right now, and in fact, you can go online to engage.mission.ca and give your feedback on our community wellness right now. As we put together this strategy, we'll have more opportunities for in-person feedback. We're talking with professionals in all those fields. We're talking with people who have lived experience, and we're talking with everyday community members like you to make sure that our community wellness amenities and systems are able to accommodate the growth that we are going through and the challenges that we're facing right now. Things like housing affordability, poverty, opioid crises, doctor shortages, just to name a few. So please do go online. Our aim is to complete that plan, and I believe it's November of this year, or is it December? Do you remember, Taryn? Near the end of the year. The other thing that you remember is that roughly this time last year, the city of Mission was named a city, and that was an opportune time for us to realize that we were going to need to go back, whether it's our website or our signs or our business cards, and change some of the hard parts of our logo and branding. But we didn't want to just spend that money on letterhead. We really wanted to take this to be an opportunity to ask the community to define its values and vision. So that work is underway right now, and Taryn has got it going along with a community, with a consultant, and that will help to inform our next OCP, or official community plan, review. It will be a very important part of us not just looking at the next 5 years, which is what an OCP typically does, but instead defining for newcomers to our community, whether they're new people wanting to live here or new people wanting to build here, developers, or new investors in business. What kind of a community does Mission want to be? What do we want to make sure lasts? If I move away from this community or I pass away from this community, I want to know that I'm leaving a legacy that will last longer than me. Not in terms of a built facility, but in terms of our values being ingrained. And this is our opportunity for everybody to do that. So I hear people say things like, I want Mission to continue to have a small town feel. I want Mission to continue to have an exciting and vibrant arts and culture community. I want Mission to continue to be a place for diversity. I want Mission to continue to be a place where you can be here with a young family all the way up until you are a senior citizen. I want Mission to be a place with urban amenities in one portion, but rural and outdoor places in another portion. Those are the sorts of things we're hearing from people as we're going through this community visioning process, and we want to hear more from you as we continue. We also finalized our tourism strategy and have really focused on that as an economic development tool. We've also approved our employment lands strategy. And some of the things that have come out of that are looking at how tourism fits with existing residents in communities. People want to be able to still have access to community amenities for local people, but they also recognize the value of tourism as an economic driver. They want to make sure that we are minimizing impacts on people, but making that tourism experience a full one. We've also talked about leaning into institutional employment for people, as I mentioned earlier, and taking a look at all applications from the perspective of what they're going to do to help drive economic and employment development. Let's talk about reconciliation. So Mission was one of the very first communities to adopt the UNDRIP principles of reconciliation, which have now become a part of provincial legislation. And along the way, because of that, we took the approach here in Mission that we did not want to do two things that we've noticed some communities are doing. The first is we did not want reconciliation to be a purely symbolic thing. Is it important to have signage and art and so forth and to correctly name places? Yes, but those are ways of starting the reconciliation conversation. We wanted our reconciliation effort to be much more robust and lead to true partnership that benefited the entire community. And so examples of that are the historic land transfer that we had with the LMS Society, Lacamo Mathquis Math Society, and the Provincial Crown and the City of Mission. That land transfer is a win-win-win because Crown lands that were really difficult for the province to maintain have now been added to the Fraser River Heritage Park, so we have a much larger park, and some have been handed over in fee simple to this LMS Society so they can develop housing and they can develop commercial enterprise. And because they're fee simple lands, they're part of the City of Mission's tax base, they're part of economic drivers and employment opportunities for people. So it was a perfect example of how reconciliation will look here. For Mission, we're very, very much aware of where our name comes from. The fact that we were the site of a mission school many, many years ago. We want our new mission to be the leader in reconciliation. So that second thing I alluded to is to not only be active in reconciliation, but for reconciliation to come from listening to what First Nations and Indigenous leadership tells us. Instead of going and prescribing something to people with the best of intentions, we've recognized that's exactly how we got into some of these colonial troubles in the first place. This idea of paternalistically thinking we know what's best for people hasn't worked well. Instead, it's about respecting the fact that Indigenous communities understand what they need, understand what they can contribute, and will come to us as equal partners with something to contribute. And that's very much been the evidence we have. Yes, we will continue to work on these types of initiatives, such as our Indigenous Guardians training program that we've come into with Mathquis and with Kwantlen and Lacamo, where we're training young people. Well, they're not all young. There's one that's a little bit older, but people who are interested in a career in bringing environmental awareness and Indigenous values into our forest and into Fraser River Heritage Park, and they're doing environmental study. They're helping us to watch out for fires in areas where we're at risk of that. They're helping to do education and interpretation in these areas, and we'll continue to expand that program because they're providing us with opportunities for staffing issues such as we saw last year with people overwhelming some of our facilities in the Stave West area. And we will continue to look for opportunities to partner with people like the Kwantlen and Catesy when it comes to our forestry management, where we share the forest with them and have woodlot partnerships as well. Yes, we will continue to do interpretive signage. For example, in the Stave West area, we've got new signs that are going in all around the trails there. And we're working with the Lecamal First Nation, Sumats, Matsqui, and others in the Stolo territory as they are preparing to do their ground penetrating research in Fraser River Heritage Park. And once that's done, we'll be able to work on the signage that will more accurately tell the story of that park. So I went ahead too far. I'll wrap up by saying one of the most important things we've heard from people, what's really, really sometimes challenging, is that the biggest concerns on people's minds have to do with things that are really in the provincial bailiwick. And I'll almost bet you $1 right now that our provincial MLAs are on board and watching right now, because they have been very tuned in and working with us on these very same things. They understand, and I've said to both Pam and Bob recently, that when we hear from people, the single biggest things they're concerned about are highways, hospitals, and high schools, those 3 H's. They really want to know that those things are going to come into Mission as Mission grows. And we are advocating and doing some strategic work to make sure those advocacy pieces are more likely to succeed. So let me talk about highways first. We understand that people want to see an improvement on that Murray-Glasgow overpass. It's become a bit of a hot point with people. What people may not understand is that the City of Mission doesn't own that structure. And frankly, even if we did own that structure, our interest would not be in just replacing it with another structure just like it, but frankly with something far better. So what most people don't know is that when the Mission Bridge was built approximately 45 years ago, it was originally supposed to have an eastern abutment that came up and met Highway 7, locally approximately where Stave Lake Street currently intersects. That overpass at Murray-Glasgow was a compromise as land acquisition and other issues got in the way. It was designed in a way that people thought was an advanced bit of technology. They embedded street warmers into it so that it wouldn't ice up in the winter. Unfortunately, they stopped functioning very early. And the problem with them being embedded is that you cannot put a full width or full thickness level of concrete on that structure. In order to repair it, it would be incredibly expensive. We've asked the province, instead of repairing it, to replace it entirely with a much more logical, properly situated intersection out closer to where Stave Lake Street meets the highway and meeting up with that eastern abutment to create a proper and true bypass, one where trucks can make that turn. Right now, that's a huge challenge at Murray and Glasgow. One where traffic won't build up in that narrow 2-lane strip of the highway that's very difficult to widen. So that's really been our priority. We, in the meantime, are working with the province, and we are optimistic in the next little while we will be able to designate the First Avenue corridor as a non-truck route and have trucks go around on the area south of First Avenue. And we also are working with the Ministry of Transportation on improving the Highway 7, Highway 11, and Cedar Connector intersection, which needs to improve in terms of size and timing. Again, it's constrained by some of the geography there, but it does need to grow. As anybody who's going through that area can tell you, the traffic is backing up sometimes all the way across the bridge. Similarly, when it comes to healthcare, we met recently with Fraser Health Authority, and we were joined by Mission Altogether for Healthcare and our Division of Family Practice, and we communicated to Fraser Health that our approach is to take a partnership approach. We wanted to invite them to be a part of that dialogue as well. We recognize that they have a regional approach and one that tries to base resources on what evidence tells them they need and also what resources them allow them to do. But we communicated to them that our community is highly motivated to see healthcare resources grow along with our needs, and that if they don't want people to speculate on what healthcare services we need, they should sit at the table with us and undertake a proper master plan for our community, and most likely for the North Fraser area, also to our east, because we know many people access our healthcare facilities all the way out to Sasquatch country and Lake Erie. And they came to meet with us that day. We didn't expect them to leave with a commitment because they were just two of them, but they did agree to go back and speak to their board about that. We have talked to them about working towards a memorandum of understanding where we would potentially be able to co-fund some investment and even work with the hospital district, the Fraser Valley Regional Hospital District, to meet some needs on a regional level there. The whole point is that we're trying to work through partnership with Fraser Health instead of yelling and screaming and using a political approach, because plainly and simply that hasn't worked and it's what everybody else is doing. So we better stand out by bringing some money to the table, bringing some data to the table, and being willing to work with people in partnership. And so far that looks promising. We wrote to them the other day in a formal way to ask that, and I'll hopefully have an answer for you in the next month or so if the typical timelines apply here. Lastly, schools. The Board of Education is responsible for schools, and our job is to support the Board of Education. So we do that by being co-advocates for them when we go to UBCM. Last year we did this. We met with the Minister of Education, and we asked the Board of Ed, what are some of the key things you need? What do we need to ask them? We'll be doing the exact same thing here. We asked the Board of Education for data and give them our data about growth. We did that here again just a few months ago. And we, in our central neighborhood plan in Silverdale and other neighborhoods where we expect growth, we always consult with the Board of Education. In the case, for example, of central neighborhood, we've reserved 3 identified locations for elementary schools. So we talk a lot about the high school, but I have to tell you, I am as eager to see us creating spaces for elementary schools as I am for high schools. We're doing similar things for daycare spaces, for doctors' offices, for places for the public to park in our downtown. So it's not just those pieces of infrastructure, but I want you to know that Council is working with our MP, our MLAs, our Board of Education, Fraser Health, and other community partners, including the Fraser Valley Healthcare Foundation, MATH, and other fundraisers to help improve our amenities. We're leaving no stone unturned when it comes to that sort of thing. Some of the things we've been asking about include expansion of our emergency ward, a proper home for hospice society, and then the expansion of our hospital if they can relocate them from the 3rd floor. Expanded healthcare facilities, mental health care facilities, better in-reach care for people who have mental health and addiction issues, and better assisted living facilities for people in our community who want to age in our community without moving. So, you can give us more feedback as we go along by going on engagedmission.ca. That's engaged.mission.ca. You can go on there right now and fill out our satisfaction survey. Take the short version if you're busy. Take the longer version if you want to get detailed. I mentioned earlier you can give feedback on our community wellness survey. And you can also, in a few weeks, Taryn? Do the community visioning and branding and give us input there. And sign up for our newsletter because we're constantly using this tool to get input and use it to inform our policy directions. And now it's time for me to go to your questions. So I'm going to focus my questions on policy and on things that Council has in our pipeline upcoming. I'm acutely aware of the fact that we're about to enter election season, and this is not a campaign event for myself or anybody else. So I'm going to limit my questions strictly to things that are on the books for us in terms of work we're doing. If you have a technical question and we can't answer it for you, we'll make note of it and we'll make sure we get an answer and post it with the video of tonight's session. And we're also happy to hear your feedback. So Taryn will give me questions back based on the feedback that you give. If she's seeing a question that's asked by multiple people, she'll try and frame it for me in a way that captures as many of those questions as possible. And with that, we will go to Taryn.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We've had some questions so far in our chat room. A question about developer consultation in Cedar Valley. Will this happen?
Developer consultation, I don't know if the person who typed that question can give us a little bit more clarity, but if they're talking about developer consultation on development cost charges, we did in fact agree today when we looked at that to make sure that our staff did some developer consultation on those charges. So every developer will have an opportunity to participate in that. Cedar Valley local area plan itself is not up for any kind of imminent review, but we are likely to do an official community plan review here in the next, well, my guess is the next council will have to undertake that in the next year. Typically, they're supposed to be revised every 5 years, so that will be the 5th year. When our community hasn't experienced as much growth as it has recently, it can sometimes go 8 years before a review, but I don't think we'll make it that far. And so Cedar Valley will certainly be part of that, but consultation around the OCP will be part of that. And so I know we get questions from people about being included in conversations about where is parkland designated, where are arterial routes, and so
The
forth.
commenter has clarified about your point that you made earlier about asking developers to work with neighbors when developing. So she's wondering about if there's any talk about this happening in Cedar Valley.
Oh, thank you. So the Cedar Valley local area plan is already an established area plan. And so if people are wanting to develop in conjunction with that plan, our neighborhood approach that we recently adopted said, we'll apply it where there are new neighborhood plans or where no neighborhood plan applies. So unless a person comes and asks us to do something that's not already a part of the approved neighborhood area planning there, they would normally not have to do more than the usual process. However, we strongly recommend to them that they do that. So it's something when people come and ask me for input or when they speak to other councilors, we commonly recommend to them that they do some door knocking, that they reserve a local room at a school or a hotel and have a conversation with neighbors.
Okay, so the next questions I've put together under City Hall. So there are various aspects here. Question about gas prices in Mission. Why are they as expensive as Metro Vancouver? People are observing that we don't have TransLink tax.
Thank you. I've been asked this question by a couple of people by email over the last couple of weeks, and the simple answer to the question is, I think it's a decision being made by the oil companies themselves, and I have checked and asked whether or not it's something where the city has any domain over the gas prices at all, and we simply don't. So I think it's a choice being made by the oil companies that operate the Mission gas stations, that they could be offering a lower price than they are, and they're not. And really, I think it's a piece of feedback that customers should be giving to the oil companies themselves. The city does not have any domain over pricing of commodities. In fact, government is very reluctant at any level to regulate pricing, but it's just simply something that we do not have any input in, and I have just recently checked on that for a couple of other people who've asked me. It's frustrating. I just wish I had more influence, but we don't have it.
City services do not seem adequate to property taxes paid, especially for rural residents. When will this change?
Well, I guess I'm going to take that one as feedback. First, it's a bit of a hard question to sort of interpret in terms of detail, and one where there's always going to be some amount of debate. I live in a rural area, and I think there's parts of what you've said in that question that are legitimate and parts I would want to clarify. So as a person living in a rural area, I don't pay for any type of utility other than drainage. I don't pay for sewer or water or recycling or garbage. And that's why those are separated out on a tax bill. However, I live in a rural area where taxes have been affected by very rapidly escalating property values. So my taxes were affected by that, and I'm sure others were in a very dramatic way. That's a product of the really amazing increase in property values. It's lovely if you're selling, but for those of us who aren't selling, it isn't a particularly good news story. Now, where there's some legitimacy in what people have to say are things like, for example, how often do you see a bus in your community, or whether or not the parks in your community area have as many amenities within them. And as a general rule, density pays for those things. And it's an unfortunate equation that people who want to live in the countryside, typically by having a lower density neighborhood, are not putting as much money per acre, which we'll say, into the pot. We tend to see fewer capital improvements in our community. And people often want those things, but in order to have them, for example, to have underground servicing or to have parks that are more built out, you typically have to have higher density, and then you lose the countryside. It can be frustrating. When I call an ambulance or I call a police officer, it takes longer for them to come. That's a reality. But overall, it's a matter of living in the countryside. You have a little bit less of an impact, but you also have a reduction on some of the utilities that others would pay for.
And I just have to plug the Citizen Satisfaction Survey. It's on Engage Mission that you can...
A great example of that. And the long form, the long one gives you an opportunity to get right into, because I didn't quite understand what that person specifically meant, but that survey will let you tell all of council, are you talking about the sewer, are you talking about the bus? Give us a clear idea of what you mean there.
And speaking of that, feedback, we have a couple questions about how you as mayor plan to engage with residents to get their real opinions. And then connected to this, it was another question, is how do you use survey information for decisions?
Excellent. So the first question, I think we've kind of answered a bit here. This is one of those examples right here. I go to council coffees and have great conversations with people. I try to make sure I'm out at council community events, and I know all the rest of council does too. And you have lots of amazing sidebar conversations. I've been on buses with Councillor Plecas and Councillor Gill recently, for example, talking with people and just getting an idea of what it's like to be on the bus with people. We do the community conversations, and we'll be doing more. We have an opioid forum, for example, coming up in the fall, and I think we're going to do another forum on homelessness, affordable housing, and poverty, and more community conversations. And I just want people to realize they can reach out to me anytime. I write my own letters. I write my own emails. I don't ask staff to do that for me. You call me, you'll get an answer. Somebody called me the other day and I said, what are you doing right now? And they said, nothing. I said, are you home? And they said, yes. I said, I'll be right there. So if I can go to somebody's house and take a look at what's going on in their yard, I'll do that. And I see all of council doing that, and that's what people mean by that small town feel. And the second part of the question was, what do we do with the feedback? That is something I worry about all the time, because I wish there was a really clear way for people to always see how when they sit at a community conversation, what they're saying plays a role. Sometimes it plays a really clear and direct role. For example, the community conversation information that we've been gathering will go into our next Parks and Trails and Facilities Master Plan, the arts and culture stuff. The OCP stuff and the North Mission stuff will get given to people when they're time to do the OCP review. But it also plays a role in everyday decisions councillors make. And I'll give you two examples. One of them is when it comes to budgets. If people are attending community conversations about arts and culture and they're telling us how much it matters to them to see us investing in arts activities for kids, or things like our Twilight concert series, or our Twilight markets, or our farmers market coming into the park, then we allocate those funds and budget time comes along because of that feedback. That feedback directly plays a role. And similarly, when people come to us and they raise questions, for example, about environmental challenges, they lead to us going and asking staff to do things like the land clearing bylaw I mentioned recently, or the chickens and the hens and bees policies that have come out. So because of those pieces of community input, councillors ask for new policies, new bylaws, or they revise the bylaws that we have or budgets that we have based on that feedback.
And one more question in the City Hall category is, can you talk a bit about spending, which you were mentioning, and hiring transparency?
Spending and hiring transparency.
Yes.
Well, our spending transparency is highly regulated, actually, by the Local Government Act and the Community Charter, and Mission has tried very hard to make sure that our annual reporting is done in a way that is incredibly transparent and robust. And so we've actually been awarded awards numerous years in a row for the work we've done. We just recently put our annual report out, and it's available online right now. And it gets right into the nitty-gritty about our revenue and our expenses along the way. In terms of hiring, new hires are also identified in the budget. So, for example, I mentioned that council has hired or has approved the hiring of some new positions. So 5 people in our planning and building department chiefly funded out of new building permit revenue. Similarly, we've hired some people to come into our engineering and public works department, entirely funded through the fees in that department as well. We have got this social housing coordinator coming online as well. Those are all in the annual reporting. They're also routinely a part of the conversations and updates that we're doing here. So that's exactly why we're trying to give that. Council cannot and does not want to conceal our hiring practices or our budgeting practices. In fact, we get input from people on budgeting before we go ahead. We had engage.mission.ca as well as public forum on budgeting before we adopted our taxation rates and our capital plans as well.
Okay, now shifting to transportation-related questions. This is about traffic enforcement. Why don't we have some sort of enforcement on Stave Lake Street from Lougheed all the way up? People are driving 60 to 100 kilometers per hour. It's dangerous.
Yes, they are, and yes, it is. We do have enforcement there, but what I really welcome people to do is to write to me at phorn@mission.ca if you have a specific area in your community where we want to ask the RCMP to focus their enforcement. They use a variety of technologies, including a device that they can affix to a fixed point on a road and do data analysis so that they know exactly when to deploy traffic enforcement. They can actually get really clear data in terms of what the actual average speed on a road is. That can actually help us to design roads. We're working with the ICBC to improve safety on roads, such as we're doing on Dewdney Trunk Road. But like you, I share a concern, especially as I see visitors. I think they're mostly visitors who go up and down Dewdney Trunk and Keystone and Hayward this time of the year, Wilson, really using our back roads as opportunities to recreate, but often getting up to some very excessive speeds. But if you have a concern about that, you can ask the RCMP to enhance their enforcement by reaching out directly to them at the non-emergency number, or you can happily email me and I'll pass it on. Our community policing office will go out there as well, and they will do they have a speed control sign that they use as well, and it has been effective in helping to reduce it. But I'll tell you, it's not a single step. You have to constantly do it. It's an ongoing battle and something we will continuously need to do up there.
Hey, and is Mission still planning on turning Cherry into the next truck route?
So we get asked this about, I don't know if the person means a truck route or
This person just put truck route.
This is an example of a technical question I think we'd have to get some answer on. My understanding is that Cherry already is an arterial route. So I'm not sure if the person's referring to the idea. There's been some questions from people of connecting Cherry to central neighborhood, and I'm not sure if that's the question that they mean, but we'll have to get some technical answers on that. But I believe that Cherry already may be an arterial route and an approved truck route already. But I'll have to check into that and get back to this person. But I don't believe there is any specific, I can say this, I don't believe there's any specific plan to redesignate a truck route anywhere in our community right now. The truck routes that exist are already out there. In terms of the connectivity, I'll guess that this may be the question the person was asking. The Central Neighborhood Plan does not stipulate exactly where the connection will be with the core of Mission. There are potentially 4 or 5 spots, and so there is not yet a determination, and that will be done in consultation with neighbors and based on what's going to be feasible from an environmental and topographical standpoint.
I think that the question is about the truck route and the fact that there's school zones on Cherry.
There are schools on most of our arterial roads, and unfortunately, that's just a reality. So, for example, Silverdale Elementary, Albert McMahon Elementary, ESR, Windabank, and Stave, I think West Heights and Fraserview are all on major arterial routes. And Mission, Abbotsford has many of their schools inside of neighborhoods. And some of the disadvantages of that is many of them aren't on bus routes. But the advantage of that is they're on quieter, walkable neighborhoods. Mission schools are situated largely where they are, and the vast majority of them are on arterial routes, and there is no way to kind of get around that. That's just the reality.
In your presentation, you spoke about the Murray Street overpass and the potholes. There were a few questions about that. When will there be a long-term solution? Is there anything that you would like to add?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. We've been asking. I recently wrote to them again at Roti and asked them, and we have many reasons to speak with them. One of them is about the improvements we need to do with our highway down in the waterfront area, as well as that connection up in that area. They have simply said to us two things. One is that, yes, they are continuing to work on them. And two is that the atmospheric river event of last year only aggravated some of the challenges they were having with staffing and capacity because, of course, entire sections of highway were washed out, Highway 8, Highway 5. And so I wish I could answer that question for you. It's a question I would like to know the answer to myself.
Okay, moving on to homelessness. What are we going to do about the growing homeless and increased drug problems in our community?
Again, this is one where we're having largely to be advocates to the provincial government, but some of the things that we have advocated to them to do are to help us. We've said to BC Housing, let's start taking a look at other pieces of property now. Let's not worry about let's not wait until Heard Street is built. We know that we're going to need more services, and we know we don't want all of the services to be located in one area. We'd like to have some integrated opportunities for housing. That's why we've talked with Sarah for Women, and proper housing for women and children will help to ensure that we prevent many of those sorts of issues. If people have stable housing and they have access to services, they'll be far less likely to live in a lifestyle where they're disenfranchised, marginalized, impoverished, and victims of things like addiction. And similarly, we're working with Mission Community Services to try and find a place where we are going to be able to provide some housing for youth. We've also been working with an Aboriginal housing organization to see if we can do some housing there. But how do you find the land in a community like Mission? Well, just at today's open meeting around community amenity contributions, we talked about setting aside 20% of all community amenity contributions for affordable housing. We've got a density bonusing program where if developers want to help, if they want to add to their density in a program, they have to give 10% of their housing for density. I've said not only should we be doing that, but we should be giving density bonusing if they are willing to partner with a not-for-profit organization like a Mission Association for Community Living or MCSS or a Lookout or a MASH or a St. Andrews Co-op or any Sarah for Women, any of these that are good at providing services for people. We've also said we want our density bonusing to be connected to medical and clinical spaces for people so they can come and get recovery services, mental health services, or simply access a doctor. We've been told by our Division for Family Practice there aren't enough spaces, so we've said developers give us space in buildings for these amenities. So those are examples of some of the things we can do, but to be honest with you, I would say we're facilitators or catalysts, and we don't control what the province or the Fraser Health Authority would do in terms of bringing those funding opportunities here. I mentioned it earlier, we've said we're willing to actually look at ways to co-fund things and to advocate to the regional hospital district to co-fund things, because we all recognize around that table that these are people across the region who are having needs met. In terms of dealing with the issue on the short-term basis, I'll be honest with you and tell you that I am tired of us constantly chasing our tail to worry about this encampment or that encampment, because frankly, moving people from one encampment to the other is entirely inhumane and undignified. It's below what our community should be doing, and it's a foolish use of our resources. Does that mean I think we should just leave camps where they are? No, it means that we should be helping people to move from encampments to housing that's actually suited to their needs, where they have access to transit, where they have access to the services they need, where they can get back on their feet finding jobs or having opportunities to get medical treatment, those sorts of key things. So it's something that we can do in terms of properly designating land, working quickly with people, and using our affordable housing strategy to address that, but it's going to also require the partnership I spoke of earlier.
Thank you. And I just wanted to mention that MLA Pam Alexis is online, and she just wanted to let everybody know, and she and Bob Deeth pay attention to our meetings, and they're discussing the challenges, and they've left their contact information in the chat room for everybody.
So I'll just simply say that, as I said earlier, that's not a surprise at all. Pam and I communicate multiple times a week, same with Bob, and we're constantly talking. Brad Biss is the same way. We might be talking at times about an individual constituent all the way up to a larger problem. So these are things that we're trying to tackle together.
Okay, so we have a few more questions about growth and development. How are you making the developers responsible for informing the local residents of future potential developments?
I spoke of this earlier. I said that when it comes to development that's in an area where we already have a planned area, a neighborhood plan, they aren't mandated to do something beyond our signage and our usual public hearing processes, but we do recommend it to them. In areas where there isn't a plan, for example, the area around Dunsmuir and 10th, we sat down with those developers and said, we want you to use a neighborhood approach, where they worked with the local community group and talked about some of their concerns and made sure that when they came to us, they were reconfiguring the application they brought to us so that it would fit well. An example of this is the Cade Bar and Dudney Trunk industrial lands down here. The neighbors in that area were invited through a newspaper advertisement, through a mail out, through a website, to participate in the first of a neighborhood meeting with those developers in terms of how those lands might be developed in a way to have the best impact on our economy and employment, and the lowest impact on our community in terms of impact on the residential area. They also talked about how they might preserve heritage features and so forth. So those are initial conversations that are happening before they come in with their official final application.
Okay. Let's see. Will we attempt to keep the area around Heritage Park as is? Is there any development plans for around Heritage Park that could change the way it looks to high rises?
No, I don't think there's high rises coming. On the north side of the park, some of the land that was swapped out in that area of Prentice, and I don't have the exact layout of the land here in terms of which lot it is, but that's some of the land that was swapped with the LMS Society, and so there will probably be some housing in that area, maybe even with some ground floor commercial. But that's because we've been given the rest of the park area as a buffer, and to an extra 90 years worth of park land there, 90 acres, I should say. And so I don't anticipate a heck of a lot more development in and around the park specifically itself. Up the hill on Stave Lake Street, as you get up to the area near where Best is and Knight Street is, you'll see some apartments, you'll see some townhouses, you'll see some compact lots. There won't be high rises, but there will be some compact development. And again, surrounded by trees. The whole idea is compact development with green belts all through it.
When will Mission get a new fire hall?
That I just actually was speaking of that in a way, because I was talking about the development of Cade Bar and Dudney Trunk, and the applicant for that application not only wants to build 19 acres of industrial lands with high density employment, living wage employment, but they're also going to give us, this is an exciting part of the application, donate land to the city that will become the home for our 4th fire hall, would also become a permanent home to search and rescue. Currently, the search and rescue facilities are down on the waterfront in a building that is literally falling apart, and it would also become our own training facility, which we do not yet have. So that fire hall would meet the needs of Cedar Valley, much of Steelhead, and even into Silverdale, and would likely ultimately be one where we had some full-time staff on there as we phase in staffing. So it's literally in the pipeline right now, and we do have a fire master plan that we're following.
There's a follow-up question about this area, a question about allowing industrial buildings in residential areas. So I think talking about the trade-offs.
Thank you. It's not actually an industrial, it's not actually a residential area, and I think that's something that people may not understand. It's actually a designated industrial area. It's been in our official community plan as a designated industrial area for quite some time, and I think people sometimes assume that because it's proximal to housing, that it is a housing area. But in fact, if you look at that area, for example, between where I am here at City Hall right now and heading in that area, it's largely institutional and industrial type properties. So we have the Trades College, we have our own facilities yard, and we have a prison in that area and a very large church complex in there. And on that whole block between here and Cade Bar is actually, or Dewdney Trunk is actually very few homes on this side of the actual road.
Are there any plans to move City Hall?
That's an interesting question. There aren't plans to move City Hall, but it's certainly one that I will be very interested in hearing the community talk about, because as we talk about waterfront revitalization and downtown revitalization, and as we struggle with the constant challenge of running the city out of multiple buildings, I can see us looking potentially at whether or not we need to have one facility that houses our civic facilities, such as a museum, an art gallery, civic meeting space, daycares, and potentially even, as they did in Abbotsford, they leased out their excess space to the marketplace until they needed it, as well as a place for our staff. And so it's something that would be interesting to explore. Maybe it's about redensifying property that we already have, such as the Welton Common or something like that. But at this point, there isn't a specific plan.
Why does it take a year to get a permit for a detached house?
It doesn't anymore, and it didn't take a year at any point. At the longest point, we did have wait times that were as long as 10 months. So maybe I'm parsing words here. We're down at this point to about 6.5 or 7. I looked at it earlier. It was December 16th. So what does that put us? We're July 11th. So we're at about 8 months right now, and we've reduced it a little bit for single detached homes. And the answer to the question is that it's really been very difficult to get staffing in those departments. Right now, building officials are very hard to come by. That's the single biggest issue in terms of what we on our side are responsible for. And as we hire people, we also lose people. They're getting poached by other communities. But if your building permit is taking you longer than that, it's usually because people are somehow missing that there are things that they can be doing on their end. And one of the things that one of the things we've done is we've hired a new manager of our building permit department, and he's been absolutely exceptional at sitting down with people and telling them in a really clear way, navigating them through how they can improve their applications. Because I saw one the other day where a person was complaining about how long their application had taken, and it had been sent back, I believe, a total of 7 times for fixing by the applicant. So it really was a matter of the applicant being asked to do the same thing a number of times. And that is slowing everybody else down. And that's one of the things that came out of this forum, is that some builders are frustrated because they are stuck behind a builder who has presented something that is not complete. And we're slowly trying to get through those processes while somebody else has got all their ducks in a row and needs to have their turn come up. So that's the answer to that question.
How much involvement does Mission have on transportation issues in surrounding areas? If we're a city of commuters and we have to go down Lougheed Highway through Maple Ridge and there's congestion points, is there any advocacy from Mission to help that?
Okay, good. I'm glad they specified Maple Ridge, because there are really, I would say, 3 major interfaces we have with other transit providing communities. And Abbotsford and Mission have actually a joint shared service committee, and they include some transit. And so we have an exceptional relationship with them, and that's why we built that new station at the corner of the Sumas bypass and so forth. So generally speaking, the answer to the question with Abbotsford is that we have exceptional responsiveness when working with Abbotsford. The second best is with the Fraser Valley Regional District, with communities like Agassiz and the electoral areas. We meet with them just as often as we do with Abbotsford, but we don't have a specific mechanism for lots of different shared services, and it's largely just because they don't have the same level of resources. But Mayor Pranger and I have been enthusiastically talking about having the same type of shuttle service on the North Fraser, going all the way from Kent Agassiz all the way out to catch up with the bus services that intersect in Maple Ridge. But Maple Ridge is the hardest of all of them to intersect with. Why? Maple Ridge is in Metro Vancouver, not the regional district. Maple Ridge is a part of TransLink, not BC Transit, which is what serves all of our region. So just getting the, the number escapes me. I want to call it the number 99, but it's not the number 99. Councillor Plekas would know the answer to the number of the bus, but the bus that runs on the North Shore and connects up with the Metro Transit system, that is a rather remarkable partnership because it has BC Transit working with TransLink and two communities. So it's not as common as you might think. We have reached out to Maple Ridge and asked them to have a joint council meeting and to talk about issues such as this. But at this point, I think they're focused on more local issues, and they have said that they didn't feel a need for a meeting in the short term. But the person who wrote this question, I would really appreciate if they could take a moment and send me an email with specifically what it is they'd like to see us improve, and I'll pass it on both to our transit committee as well as make sure it's on the agenda next time I do meet with Mayor Morden and his council.
Hey, we have a couple more questions. Why did the Mission ice rink roof repair cost $1 million?
That's a perfect example of a technical question I'll have to get an answer for. I wish I had the answer for you off the top of my head, but I don't know enough about that one.
We'll post
And
that.
we don't
We'll
have our
post the
Director
answer
of Parks and
tomorrow.
Rec here.
Does the city plan to purchase waterfront properties from the many private owners to implement the waterfront project? If not, how does the city plan to implement their proposed plans?
Excellent, thank you. So the city hasn't decided to buy anything from anybody down there at this point, but the answer to the question is, if the city decides it wants to, excuse me, own land as it does anywhere else in the city, the way it does it is the same way anybody else does. They call up a realtor and they buy the land. And there's other ways of doing it as well, but they literally purchase the land from the landowner at a market appraised value. The other ways that they can do it are through land swapping. So for example, if a developer wants to attach a piece of land on one area and the city owns it and give up some land that the city wants, perhaps, and this is very common with green belts, for example, or foreshore or setback areas, then they swap the land. Or a third option is something I mentioned earlier, density bonusing, so that what happens is a developer gets more use out of the footprint of their property. Instead of building something 2 stories, they can build it 4 stories, for example, and they essentially trade for that improved density some of their lands. People have recently asked me about this as though this is something new, and I have to tell you, it's very common. It's entirely the way that all cities operate, and cities acquire land through the same ways as regular home purchasers or other land purchasers, as well as these other tools. So the land that the city has planned for, and it's important to talk about it that way, it's a plan, not a project, would be acquired through those mechanisms. They're not expected to be just given over by landowners. Landowners are given fair market compensation in one of the ways I just described, and it's a process that's very careful, and it's one that's overseen by the Local Government Act and by our own bylaws and policies, and it's a standard process. I'll say one more thing about the waterfront. People have asked me recently about the foreshore, and they said, why is the foreshore projected as part of the waterfront strategy to be public use? And the answer is really simple. It's twofold. First, it's what the public said they wanted as we went out and we asked for public input. In other words, the people of the city have said they want us to invest in Fraser River foreshore to some extent as public lands, the same way as they want us to expand our park holdings in some places or add to the Stave West trail network, similar types of things as we would do with any other community outdoor amenity. The second reason is that most of the time foreshore lands are protected from development anyways. And so unless an industrial use needs to access directly to the water, in which case it would and it should. It's typical for there to be a setback between the front of a business or of an enterprise and the shore of a stream or the shore of a river or lake.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the comments. We don't have any more questions.
Wow, I think this is the same thing as last time. We actually ended early. I'm a bit surprised.
2 minutes early, so
Wow, that's rather remarkable. Well, we really want to thank people for taking the time today to listen in and to ask us questions. If you didn't want to ask a question this way, or you asked a question but you have more to say, please feel free to reach out. Again, my email is phorn@mission.ca. And you can also write to all of council by writing info@mission.ca and asking, just simply in your email, ask for Mission Mayor and Council, and they'll be shared that way. I'm more than happy to share comments with Council by writing as well. If you had a technical question that we didn't answer tonight, we'll get it to you and put it up online underneath this video later on. I wish I could have answered some of those technical questions, but we'll get you those answers. So thank you once again. No other questions there in the time that we have left there? Well, thank you very much, Taryn. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this. And I look forward to hearing from you, as I know my council colleagues do, in the next 6 months before we have an opportunity to do that, or whoever is in this job has a chance to do that. Thank you again, and have a good night.